Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another Alternate History Hearts of Iron 4 video. Dang, you all gave some interesting suggestions here this last time. As I'm sure many of you are aware by now, the way things work on here is that in the alternate history videos that I post to this channel, the top 4 most liked comments on those videos gets put into a poll for the next round in order to be able to determine what the next video is going to be. In this case, by an overwhelming margin, a lot of you wanted to see what would have happened if Iran modernized like Japan did and joined the Axis. This is fascinating, and actually, these were some of the most fascinating alternate history suggestions I think I've seen in here in a while. And so this suggestion is going to require some work, but believe it or not, it's not necessarily that far-fetched. First and foremost, there are multiple parts to the scenario that we were building in the first place, and in order to make it, we're going to be using the Road to 56 mod, which, on that note, you can already see with the Discardian version that it has a whole Christmas theme going into it, which we are going to actually be doing something here for Christmas. Yes, of course we are, my friends, but simultaneously we'll be ignoring at least that part here for right now while I'm making this alternate history scenario. But here we are, Iran 1936, something that is very interesting, and I'm sure that many people are already aware. Iran gets invaded in 1941 as part of historical games, where the British as well as the Soviet Union decide to take them out. The reason being is because of perceived friendliness to the Germans and not wanting to let the Germans get access to Iranian oil supplies. This largely being because what you can see up here, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, this is something that provided a ludicrous amount of oil, because the British had oil rights here down in this territory right here, that was specifically feeding the Allied war effort. If that instead went to Germany, that could be huge and fuel the German war machine for literally years. Like literally, it would fuel it. In addition to that, the other reason that the Iranian state was taken over was specifically because the Soviets needed Lend-Lease, and unfortunately taking things by sea route and then dropping it off up here in the northern part of the Soviet Union was not really practical, because A, anything could just be taken out by submarines up here, which would lose so much equipment, and that wasn't really feasible. The second and probably more important thing is that there was actually a time limit, because all of the different ports up here get literally frozen in ice and can't be used for like a third or half the year. So a land route for Lend-Lease, specifically the rail lines that would run through Iran here, these are things that would prove to be immensely valuable and provided a large amount of Lend-Lease logistics for the Soviets. But let's say none of that did happen. Let's say that Iran goes and actually takes the fight to the Soviet Union and resists the Allies. How does any of that work? Well, as I said, this is a multiple part scenario, and we're going to need to explain that. First and foremost, the reason that we are using the Road to 56 mod here in this case is because not only does it provide way more that we can do with like national ideas and different ways to customize our nation to show what we would be doing in alternate history, but simultaneously, Iran in the base game does not have a focus tree, and in the Road to 56, it does. For the historical setting going into this in the first place, our leader is this guy, Reza Shah Pahlavi, who is the person that is the Shah of Iran and had actually taken over the state back in the year 1925 after the previous kind of corrupt, ineffective, terrible regime of what existed before. Iran kind of had a constitutional monarchy that came into existence after the complete decay of the previous imperial state that existed before. That would require a whole other explanation in and of itself for how all that worked down, and this is not a dedicated history video, so maybe I'll do something like that in the future on my actual history geopolitics page, the History of Everything podcast. But in short, this is the guy that from the year 1925 would rule all the way until 1941, and he is a fascinating character because he is someone who was a absolute monarch, yes, but simultaneously, he dragged Iran kicking and screaming into the modern era, and I mean that quite literally. He was a person that over the course of his rule advocated for more secular rule within Iran. He wanted to remove a lot of the religious superstition and backwardness of so much of the state, specifically modernizing it, its bureaucracy, its military, its agriculture, its science, its everything. He wanted to drag it into the modern era, and this is something that made him both quite popular with a number of the peasants where he was able to reform things, but simultaneously pissed off a lot of religious leaders. So yeah, you can see from his trait here that he's a superficial modernizer because yes, he does actually want to industrialize and modernize the state, but simultaneously he was still an autocratic ruler who would control things absolutely, and yes, Iran was quite corrupt in this time, much as the same as it was throughout pretty much all of its history. In fact, it's fascinating to say that he did strengthen the state by quite a bit, but he didn't really get the military up to speed, at least not enough in time. Come 1941, the army of Iran was just hopelessly outclassed by both the British and the Soviets, and very quickly the state was overwhelmed. With its minuscule industrial base, it just didn't really have the capacity to be able to do much. But the timeline that we are building here now in this alternate history is, what if they had modernized like Japan did? Well, by that logic, what we're going to have to say is that their modernization does not begin in 1936. It starts back in 1925, or arguably even earlier, back when things were still a constitutional monarchy, and Iran possibly got more investment and strengthened itself further during that point in its history. Now, how are we going to do this, you may wonder? Well, we're going to make a very simple argument. If you go over here to trade, you can see that the British have trade rights in the biggest oil-producing province in the country, Khuzestan. We are not going to be able to strip that from the British, as one of the key ways that the Iranian state was able to get money in the first place was specifically a deal with the British, where the British would actually take 84% of the profit. Yeah, that is the thing. In exchange for allowing the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to be able to develop and pretty much get all oil rights in this province and area, the Iranian state would receive 16% of the proceeds. This, very obviously, was quite unfair, but it did give a large surplus of cash that the state was able to use, if only it had been a little bit less corrupt in order to be able to actually properly use it. So the argument that we're going to make here is that one of the things that happens is that there were several rounds of renegotiations that the state would launch with the oil company, and we will say that instead of 16%, the state maybe got 20% or 25%, that they got more of this money, and that as a result, maybe with a little bit less corruption, more money was invested specifically into the state. Also, by that same logic, technology-wise, Iran is very backwards. We will say from the very beginning that, just like in the case of Japan, that they were able to bring about many different Western advisors, etc., and unlock certain technologies earlier. In fact, right now I'm going to tag switch over to Japan, and then what technologies did they actually have over on this side? They got engineers and recon, they already have trucks unlocked, they have trains, they have early railway guns, they have light armor, they have basic stuff for artillery. Ships aren't really going to matter nearly as much here in this case. They don't really have as much for engineering, industry, but they do have the basics for synthetics and refineries, and that is pretty much it. So, oh yes, and of course, they have all the basic stuff here for airframes. Anyway, in order to justify that the Iranian state had already modernized, because really, that's the only way that Iran would even be willing to do any kind of conflict with the Soviet Union in the first place, we are going to say that it is a little bit more powerful. Go ahead and put automatic research, and then with that, we are going to get very basic technologies out of the way. First off, the stuff here for aircraft, we will get that secured. There's nothing in the way of engineering, industry-wise, nothing there. SRD, nope. Basic stuff for artillery, all that is the same. We're going to go ahead and give them the one thing here for armor, for basic armor. Give them trucks. Make sure that they have trains. I mean, after all, Iran has railways. It doesn't make sense that they wouldn't have trains researched from the very get-go, and basic railway guns. Make sure they have recon company, and then past that, nothing else. Okay, so we've given them just these base technologies to start. In addition to that, because we're making the argument that they got more of the money, not just 16%, but maybe 20% in the beginning, and then this was renegotiated for higher amounts of money later, we will say that the Iranian state had more to spend and invested more in itself. So instant construction, and with that, we are going to give more civilian factories. I'd say 2 additional civilian factories as well as a military factory. It's nothing huge, but that as a base is what it's going to have. The final change that we are going to make is that modernization needs to take place faster. If you go over to the focus tree of Iran and what it has in this mod, there is quite a bit that it has for specifically modernizing its industry, something that you'd see over on this side. And then simultaneously, between all the different government paths, the fascist, the monarchist, non-aligned, the democratic path, or the communist path, we will be going with the historical one of continuing the government purges. The more we let a politician entrench himself, the more likely he is to try and extricate himself from royal influence. To ensure that this does not happen, forced dismissals will be necessary. Yes, historically, Pahlavi, during this time, would specifically purge the government of dissidents, of people that would stand against him, communists especially, which you can see down here with the trial of the 53, and he would try to secularize society. What we will say is that these things were done earlier. Not just in like the 1930s, which would, lead to a period of instability before it is they're able to act. Pahlavi would take place and do this maybe in 1930, 1931, 1932, a couple years prior, so that his policies have more time to be able to, well, foster the necessary thought. In fact, one of the crazy things about Pahlavi here that a lot of people don't really know is that he is a person who's responsible for specifically lots of the infrastructure, education, healthcare, social, all the different reforms. He even at one point would go and outlaw, like, the hijab. For an Islamic society, that is huge, and that earned him a lot of hatred from the clergy. We will possibly make the argument in here that although he secularizes society, things aren't as unstable for him because he does not take as harsh of a stance in specifically banning things like the hijab. At least not yet. Things are just perhaps discouraged. So the government will have been purged, the army will have more funding, and society will be more secularized. Those are the only ones that we are doing specifically on this side right now. The big thing, though, is industry, and what we are going to say is that a couple things are done from the very beginning. Notice how Expand Tehran University specifically says that it was officially inaugurated in 1934. Well, it's 1936, so this theoretically should already be done. And we will say that they have this done because Iran is now a more modern state. I'm sorry this is taking so long to actually build up, but it's important that we establish this as background for the scenario that we are creating. His reforms work. So, more foreign exchange controls happen. They import more machines from an early age in order to be able to have a stronger industrial base. The Trans-Iranian Railway is finished. And Tehran University is developed. After that, the only other thing that we will do is we will say that a Western military bureaucracy was adopted. The former Qajar dynasty would neglect the formation of the standing Iranian army until its downfall in 1925. While we were quick to secure additional funds for the Iranian armed forces, it is still in a poor state with young, incompetent officers and disorganized arms commanders. Adopting foreign army command structure and hierarchy will improve the performance of the standing army. We will say that this was done earlier. That is it. That is the only things, and I say that, I did literally 5 focuses, which is a lot of time to do. That is going to be the end of that. Autocomplete is over, and from here we can actually build our story. And so, okay, now we can finally begin in 1936. I'm sorry, guys. I know that takes a while here, but this actually requires some real setup in order for it to take place because we're talking about modernizing a state, and simultaneously, there are very real justifications that we could use in order to be able to explain this. It is not that complicated. But hey, even though we can actually do things now, the reality is we can't really do anything except modernize our state more, because that's exactly what happens. Just because Iran modernized more does not mean that it is going to go and invade everything. Ironically enough, the path that you would have here of either becoming diplomatically balanced, which is the historical path of what would happen, where Iran would try to stay neutral, and then the Allies said, no. Instead, we are going to be going with a pro-German diplomatic route, which is going to have us go and join the Axis. But Iran is not going to join with the Germans and attack the British. They still needed the British for trade and everything else. And then simultaneously, the whole aggressive pan-Iranianism and the fun thing that can actually happen in old history, where it's like, oh, go and retake Afghanistan and reclaim Iraq. Yeah, to recreate the Persian Empire. That is hilarious, but they wouldn't do this. Iran was focused very internally, and the idea of waging an external war to take out Afghanistan and Iraq, bringing in those populations, which hadn't gone through years of modernization efforts like Iran did, yeah, you're going to be bringing in a bunch of people that are not going to be happy, which is going to destabilize your state further. So really, none of this is going to happen. And instead, we have to wait until Barbarossa actually takes place for, going and waging war on the Soviets. So instead, nope. Iran will focus during this time on increasing its economy, stabilizing the population, increasing textile production, and everything else. We're going to kind of speed run through all of this. In fact, even though we're going to be supporting the Germans, we wouldn't be buying stuff from the Germans here, at least in the beginning. We'd be buying stuff from the British. This kind of trade relation is something that, even with a more pro-German stance, that is something that would happen. And with that, my friends, let's begin. Immediately from the get-go, pretty much any and all efforts would specifically be put towards building up the economy of Iran. We can make an argument that more efforts were taken to specifically crack down upon corruption, etc., etc. All this could be done, yes. And that the state would focus during this time on specifically employing the people, in getting them to work in more productive ways. As an example, sugar exports. In an effort to reform the agrarian sector, new plantations have been imported to Iran, particularly sugar beets, and subsequently many sugar refineries were built, producing more than 40,000 tons of sugar per year so far. Effective things to be done. After that, with the increased funds that the state would have, weapons deals would be secured, likely in this case with the British, with the French, with other foreign powers, as Iran would again not be siding with the Germans. They would specifically be making deals in order to align themselves with a variety of different entities in order to be able to play it the whole neutral game. In order to pay for these funds, more efforts would be made on obtaining oil from the locations that, well, the British don't have oil rights to. In doing so, this would drastically increase the amount of trade that Iran would be able to engage in, thus giving the state more money. And so to that end, as it is that we are building up our varying different factories, efforts are made. So we're going to go ahead and get an industrial person, a captain of industry, and a silent workhorse, because we are going to say that the government and industry was working significantly more in order to be able to modernize the state in this time. Which, on that note, an event, Trial of the 53. Many supporters of the Communist Revolution and Tudeh Party of Iran were eagerly using their education, respectful positions in society, and foreign ties to sway the mindset of our people and drive them away from us. 53 supporters have been arrested and now face their rightful justice in one of the most sensational political trials in Iranian history. Yes, this is something that the stench of communism is going to be clamped down upon. And that is actually something that is historical, that Pahlavi was an ardent anti-communist, and he did not like the Soviet Union at all. There is a thing that if Iran had been capable of intervening in the Soviet Union and taking back some of the territory that they had taken, such in the case of Azerbaijan and others, that they would gladly do so. But you can't do that without a proper army first. Christmas 1930. Yeah, see, this is the event that I was talking about here. The Road to 56, the Discardian version, put in this sort of thing. I'm going to ignore this right now. We're going to figure this out in the future when I do my Christmas special episode. Still, one of the key things that would happen in this time is that German trade would be encouraged. For many years, we strengthened the diplomatic and economic ties with our German friends, since they were the only European power that had no imperialistic ambitions in the Middle East. Iranian and German engineers, constructors, and builders worked shoulder to shoulder on improving our country and bringing our undeveloped industry into modern standards. Yes, historically, this did happen. There were a couple thousand, I think, like Germans that were in Iran over the course of the 1930s heading into the early 1940s. And the reason they were there were largely in, different technical fields to bring the Iranian state to a more modern stance. This is something that actually, later on, once the war actually broke out, greatly pissed off the British, who wanted them gone. But of course, that's not going to happen. And we will say that the relations started earlier and was more fruitful in this new timeline that we are constructing that helps to build the Iranian state up to be stronger than it was. The Sadabad Pact. Mohammad Hashim Khan has approached Reza Shah Pahlavi with the suggestion of signing a mutual non-aggression pact, leaving open the prospect of further cooperation in the future. The Afghan diplomats worked hard on their pitch, going into detail about our nation's mutual histories and interests, followed by an earnest appeal to peace between the brotherly nations. The back and forth negotiations have been pleasant, but the choice of whether we sign or not ultimately falls to us, and the answer is yes. Here's the thing. We could say, yes, Iran goes on a warpath and goes and conquers everything because they are a modern state now and have so much more power. Sure, yeah, we could. But that's not likely to happen historically. Even with additional years of modernization efforts, more control is going to specifically be made on maintaining things within the state rather than waging war abroad. That is the realistic answer. So yes, we will sign the pact, we will increase relations, and this is something that will be necessary to try and maintain. Because this is arguably around the time that the Shah would push for more secular nationalism. Religion belief might still be present in the minds and hearts of our soldiers and officers. We should remind our troops that the true values lay not within their faith, but within the country, its leadership, its internal and external policies. They fight for our people and for people only. The argument that we can make is that the Shah pushes for more secularization within the military itself, and specifically doesn't push it as much when it comes to society, which allows him to not piss off nearly as much of the rural clergy that proved to be a problem for him historically. Like, note here, in the Road to 56 mod, we get the whole thing for restoring the lion's might and taking over everything for the Persian Empire. Yeah, we're not going to do that. That's another alternate history. What if Iran went and reformed the Persian Empire? That is its own fascinating thing. But, yeah, not going to happen quite here. Instead, more efforts will be put into things for refining, building up industry, and specifically making as much money as possible. So you see, my friends, at this point in 1937, the thing that you'd probably anticipate if we were just playing this as a regular game is that we would beeline down pro-German diplomacy, we would go and start doing all these things and build ourselves up to an even greater superpower, Except no, we're playing a historical game in here, or I say ahistorical. We're trying to create that story. And so all the varying different things that you see here are things that wouldn't be done. Realistically, even in the event that Iran goes and modernizes itself, prepares itself like Japan, it did have a somewhat decent amount of resources in here. It wasn't eager to take everything over, or at least not necessarily yet. They wouldn't be able to do this with Iraq or Afghanistan, realistically speaking, outside of this game. And so none of this is really set to happen. You're not going to see more pro-German diplomacy, arguably, until the actual outbreak of World War II. And then even past that point, there's not going to be an attack upon the Soviet Union or anything else until Operation Barbarossa. That would make no sense otherwise. So, instead, we will continue to just modernize, ignoring all of this, even though this would actually be better and more beneficial for us. And so instead, efforts will be put on enlarging and modernizing the military, with specifically the officers needing to be controlled. Whether Iran would continue to send cadets abroad, or whether or not they would go and invite foreign officers, that is a matter for debate. Arguably, they would end up doing some of both, but really we can only choose one. So what we will say here is that in an effort to not just invite foreign powers into the country, which could be seen as something damaging for the Shah's rule, instead cadets will continue to be sent abroad. When this is done years earlier, like in the mid-1930s, instead of the beginning of 1940 or something, this means that things are going to be able to be done on time. After that, we can't do anything else until we determine our doctrine, which brings up the interesting question of exactly what it is that Iran would do. In the Road to 56 mod, there's 5 different ones that you can do, not 4, so instead of just utilizing, mobile warfare, it has a whole thing for asymmetrical warfare for, guerrilla tactics, but this is Iran, not Afghanistan, so they're not going to be going and doing that one. Instead, considering the Western education that would be done, as well as the lack of industry that would be necessary for mobile warfare and superior firepower, Grand Battle Plan is likely what is going to be chosen. British and French influence is present in every branch of our internal-external policies, industry, resource extraction, economic cooperation, exports, imports, and now also in the army. Well-planned defense and proper entrenchment will benefit not only our armed forces, but our regime as well. After that, then, it brings up the question of either revising the universal drafting law, which is something that would go and revise things so that scientists and intellectuals and civil servants aren't required to do stuff in the military, which can increase our overall stuff for planning, yes, or maintain universal drafting, which will put more men into the military. What I can say here that is likely to happen is that the universal drafting law will be maintained and perhaps even expanded upon. The reason being is that with more money going into the state, this can be afforded, and simultaneously, the more men go into the military, which has been secularized, the more likely it is that these ideals will then cross over into the population. From that, heading into 1938, the military would likely be expanded upon. Now, as we build up more political power, this is where things are going to get more interesting. We can start crafting our nation based off the realistic thing that we are constructing here. So, naturally, after innovation and focus specifically on modernization, political efforts would be put underway in order to be able to secure the nation. There is a question of Bill of Rights. This is a very possible thing that could happen, I guess, maybe, but the problem with the Shah here is that even though he wants to modernize the state, and he does put all the stuff in for education for women and for everything else, he's still going to rule over the country with an iron fist. And so that whole point means that military junta and then literally iron fist, that is what we are going to be doing. With the army of Iran largely being modernized at this point, now begins a period of rapid expansion. Of course, an interesting decision that has to be made is what exactly to do about focusing things with the economy, either focusing on greater factory output and pushing things for greater industrial capabilities for the state, or taking more care of the population. Being a state in the Middle East with plenty of oil, the likely thing to happen is that a limited welfare state would be set up by Iran in order to be able to not only aid the population, though of course this is something that the state would probably take a decent amount out of, but simultaneously it would keep them pacified. And this is something with the greater secular changes that would be made would likely aid the population further, binding them to the Shah. And there you have it, my friends. 1939, Poland goes and refuses the German ultimatum. At this point, everything goes to crap in Europe. By the middle of 1940 and the collapse of the Netherlands, Belgium, and then subsequently France, this is what would galvanize Iran to look for a more pro-German stance. Now, it says in here that we are going to go and join the Germans, like we are going to join the Axis, but Iran is not going to engage militarily. Instead, this is going to be more of a relation, specifically in order to be able to align ourselves more with German policy and engage in greater amounts of trade. Something that the British, though they will likely complain, will not be able to do much, especially in 1940, as they are going to be threatened by Italy here when it comes to Egypt. and wouldn't be able to necessarily do anything until going into 1941, just as in our own timeline. So, there you have it. Middle of 1940, Iran joins the Axis, though it's not actually what would happen. Instead, some kind of bilateral trade agreement would likely be established. More importantly, from this, what we are then going to see become available is steel deals. Distancing ourselves from Britain and supporting German interests in the region might damage our economy in the short term, yes, which obviously it would, but the long-term benefits would be worth it. German lack of oil and abundance of steel are well known, and we shall strike a deal to secure our share of their trade as equal partners. This is the big thing. Efforts would be specifically made to nationalize and remove British control from the region here of Khuzestan, which provides a ludicrous amount of oil for the British. The British, who in turn are not able to actually do anything to stop it because, well, they have their own problems here with the Italians to deal with. With steel deals, this of course removes British control from the region. Instead, what it does is it gives Germany access to a source of oil, which, although not necessarily very large, would be something that would greatly aid them. And more importantly, it gives us ourselves a large supply of steel. This steel, which in turn would be used to pursue a greater militaristic policy within the state. Potentially by this time, with greater money, greater time, greater preparations, greater pretty much everything, Iran would have a military that would be 2, 3, maybe even 4 times what it was in 1941 in our own time. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Italians will perform really well or anything, but with greater access to oil and resources, both Germany as well as Italy will likely perform better, and Germany will be able to keep up more of its air warfare against the UK than it did in our own time. This being because they're not ready to run out of fuel at any given point. Now the thing is, regarding our scenario in which Persia declares war, they're not going to be doing so right at the beginning of Barbarossa. That does not really make sense. As Germany goes and launches its attack, it's going to sweep up millions of men. And after years of building up the military, Iran actually would be in a state to do something, but they're not going to be prepared to do so until several months in after it is that those millions of men that the Soviet put on the front have been swept up. In our own timeline, I believe it was August of 1941 that a mutual invasion of Iran was launched by the British as well as the Soviets. But the thing is, in this new timeline, with the Iranians having more men, a larger military, this means that any attack upon them would have to be, well, better prepared. It would require more men. And then in addition to that, because of the additional oil and resources that the Axis would have, it appears that the Italians in this new timeline have performed better to the point that a counterattack has not been able to be launched. No, instead what could possibly happen is that going into August of 1941, as hundreds of thousands or possibly millions of Soviet troops have been swept up on the Eastern Front, the Iranians may be enticed to reclaim the territory that the Soviets took from them, the Azerbaijan concession. With British forces distracted by incursions into Italy and the Soviets unable to do anything in the midst of the German onslaught, considering that the Iranians have increased forces at this point, the Iranians join in on an attack, not against the wider allies, but specifically against just the Soviets. Within a matter of weeks, Baku would be surrounded. The greatest oil fields of the Soviet Union, not only under threat, but specifically taken. In the aftermath of the German invasion of the West and the trade deals that they signed with the Soviets, they wouldn't need nearly as much of this oil, which means that the Soviet Union would not have been getting as many resources, funding, or other things from the Germans. And then with the greater amount of oil and other resources the Germans would have had, it means an even potential stronger Barbarossa, which means more forces would have been drafted from other parts of the Union and sent to the Eastern Front, thus potentially leaving Baku less guarded. The fall of Baku. The city of Baku, one of the world's largest oil-producing centers, has fallen to Iranian troops. Willing to desperately protect this crucial resource, Soviet soldiers fought to the last man. Deprived of ample supplies of black gold, the conduct of the war will be much harder for the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. Within the span of a matter of months, Iran would be able to seize pretty much all of the oil-producing lands of the Soviet Union and the Caucasus. Coupled with that, any invasions that they would launch into the southern reaches of the Soviet Union in the varying different stands, we're talking about Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc., this is something that would likely go over rather easily. The reason I say that is because the Muslim population down here was always fairly difficult to control and would likely have not offered much resistance. Of course, even though the British, the French, and the Americans would not have been necessarily friendly to the Soviet Union per se, the alliance that they made was one out of, well, necessity. Having the Soviet Union come under mass threat specifically from the South would be seen as a massive threat for the Allies, something that would likely cause the British to go and declare war upon the Iranians eventually, or at least in the very beginning, cut off all economic ties. This is something that probably could have happened even earlier with the nationalization of oil services, but this is where things start to get pretty questionable. Eventually, even with the greater gains that are likely to be made, the forces of Iran are going to become somewhat spread out. They're not going to be able to push as far because they won't have simply the numbers. Still, the Soviet loss of oil would be a massive blow. As forces are redirected to the south in order to be able to combat the Iranians and try and seize it back, their resources would drain even faster, thus further allowing German forces to move in at a more rapid pace. With Stalingrad cut off and starved, this means that now a land route access is able to be made between Romania, Germany, and the state of Iran, thus allowing oil to flow even faster. Now, even though huge sweeps are likely to be made, it does not mean that the Soviet Union is going to immediately fall. That is absolutely not going to happen. But simultaneously, without the resources of oil to back this up, this means that the massive fleet of Soviet tanks that they are able to produce in order to throw at the German lines are going to run out of fuel. They're not going to be able to do anything like it is their own timeline. Instead, these tanks would likely serve as defensive guns, nothing more. Even though Moscow does not fall by Christmas, it still is likely to fall. In fact, what is interesting to note is that it is possible mind you, that maybe elements even within the United States are willing to support us against the Soviet Union, thinking that, well, we'll be able to deal with the Germans anyway. No, my friends, heading into early to mid-1942, at this point deprived of oil for almost a year, it means that the Soviet Union would have been forced to import large amounts from the United States, and even then, it would not be enough. Without the ability to counter German armor, without the ability to counter German air, the planes, the tanks, nothing would be able to run. The Soviet Union would collapse. Now, the negotiations at this point for what would likely happen are interesting. The Muslim territory of the Soviet Union would of course be placed under the control of Iran. Romania would be given back the territory that was rightfully its, and the remaining territory would be taken by the Germans. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, this is where the Germans would begin their master plan. They would specifically begin systematically removing people from the Slavic regions. Reichscommissariats, of course, would be set up in the territory that they controlled, and resources and anything of value would be extracted from it. Now, in game logic, what happens here is that this territory, all of varying different factories, or at least a percentage of it, goes to the German Reich, and their industry becomes absolutely supercharged. The reality of this is that although they would be able to steal immense amounts of resources from the Soviet Union, garrisoning this territory would take ludicrous, and I mean ludicrous, amounts of resources. Particularly for the plans that they desired, they wish to systematically remove all the population, which means that you would require massive amounts of forces here to do so, coupled with the fact that just because the Soviet Union collapses does not mean that everyone is just going to give up and then side with the Germans. No, that's not going to happen. Guerrilla war would be a constant thorn in the German side. Iran, in this instance, would see the same thing, though likely at the same time they would see a greater degree of stability than they would in other areas due to the fact that the more Muslim population of the southern reaches of the Soviet Union would likely support them. Still, no efforts would be made to join in on the war, to attack British India, to go after Iraq, to go after anything. Instead, the Pahlavi dynasty would have to begin to consolidate this varying territory. In fact, chances are this territory is not going to be directly controlled. The vassal states would of course be set up based off the ethnicity of the region, such as the Kazakhs, the Turkmens, the Republic of Altai, etc. The territory that is likely to be more directly controlled, though, is the Caucasus. The reason being because the source of oil that would be in here, the Georgians, the Armenians, etc., would not be allowed to have their own independence. Instead, this territory would be directly controlled and administered by the Iranian state in order to be able to extract as much wealth out of it as possible. Still though, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it does mean that more German forces, more Italian and other forces are able to be diverted to other fronts of the battlefield. With less oil to be able to supply the Mediterranean fleet, it means, well, it is possible for Italy to go and take Egypt, potentially. Oh dear God, the Germans actually launched a strike upon Ireland. How did you even manage to sneak that past? Little commandos went and launched a small strike. Oh dear God, the United States has invaded Japan. Well, I can distinctly say that one of the things that would likely happen in the scenario is that without the Soviet Union to send vast amounts of Lend-Lease equipment to, instead, those resources would likely be dedicated towards arming American forces and preparing for a launch into Japan. The fighting would be absolutely brutal in this event, and millions of people would perish, but eventually, Japan just does not have the capabilities to stand against the United States. Europe, however, would kind of turn into a stalemate. Yes, Egypt would fall, but it does not mean that wider Africa would. The Navy would still be one of Britain's greatest strengths, and the Germans would not be able to combat that even after potentially seizing Soviet sources. From here, things would devolve effectively into a stalemate, likely going on for years until some kind of potential truce could be drawn up. Instead of 1945, war could theoretically go until 1948, 1950. At that point, it becomes a matter of nukes. But I don't want to wait 7 years and then start spawning vast amounts of nukes. Yeah, if a truce is not reached before that, it's going to turn into nuclear hellfire. With that, my friends, I think that we are going to end things here today. Iran, in the end, would achieve all of its imperial glory in this event that they somehow modernized and were able to strike. But it does not mean that they would be able to go and do things further, taking out Afghanistan, Iraq, or anything else. The new Persian Empire is not going to exist in that kind of sense. Instead, it is going to consolidate its holdings, becoming a vast Muslim state, and from here, you could arguably get the Iranian Caliphate. Either way, my friends, we are going to end things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. I will see you next time, and make sure to put your comments in the comment section below for what alternate history we should do next. Goodbye, my friends. See you next time.